November 8, 1859, 2:47 p.m. The Thornhill Plantation Mansion in Clark County, Alabama, stood 3 stories tall with white columns stretching 32 feet from ground to roofline. Built from Georgia pine and Carolina brick at a cost of $18,000 over 2 years of construction. Inside the kitchen house, a separate building located exactly 87 feet behind the main mansion to prevent cooking fires from spreading, a man named Isaiah Webb stirred a pot of beef soup while calculating how many minutes remained until the entire plantation burned to ashes. Isaiah was 34 years old, stood 6 feet 1 inch tall, weighed 183 pounds, and had worked as head butler for the Thornhill family for 11 years. What Colonel Marcus Thornhill didn't know, what none of the family knew as they prepared for that evening's dinner party hosting 40 guests from across the county, was that Isaiah had spent the previous 6 months systematically preparing to destroy everything the Thornhills owned using nothing more complicated than rendered animal fat, cotton wadding, and an understanding of how fire travels through buildings with 12-foot ceilings and pine floors dried by 11 Alabama summers. The soup Isaiah stirred contained beef, onions, carrots, and 3 pounds of lamb fat that had been rendering in the pot for 90 minutes at a temperature Isaiah estimated at 380 degrees Fahrenheit, based on how quickly water droplets evaporated when they hit the pot's surface. The fat was critical to Isaiah's plan, not for the soup, but for what Isaiah intended to do with it after Colonel Thornhill's dinner party concluded and the 63 people living and working at Thornhill Plantation were either asleep or distracted. Isaiah had been collecting animal fat for 6 months, claiming he was making soap for the household, which was true except that soap requires lye, and Isaiah had been making soap without lye, producing a substance that looked like soap but was actually concentrated, highly flammable fat mixed with cotton fibers that would burn at temperatures exceeding 600 degrees and couldn't be extinguished with water. Isaiah had hidden 47 pounds of this material in 23 different locations throughout the mansion over the past 4 months, placing fist-sized portions behind baseboards, under floorboards, inside wall cavities, in attic spaces, anywhere that wouldn't be discovered during normal cleaning but would ignite if fire reached it. The plan had started forming in Isaiah's mind on May 3, 1859, when he had witnessed Colonel Thornhill sell Isaiah's wife Martha and their 2 children, David, age 8, and Rebecca, age 6, to a cotton broker from Mobile for $2,100 to cover gambling debts the colonel had accumulated during trips to New Orleans. Martha had begged Thornhill not to separate the family. Isaiah had offered to buy their freedom using money he had saved over 11 years of service, approximately $340 hidden in a tin box buried near the slave quarters. Thornhill had refused both requests and had the family loaded onto a wagon, while Isaiah was forced to watch from the mansion's front steps, forbidden from saying goodbye. The wagon had traveled down the plantation's main drive at approximately 4 miles per hour, disappearing into the tree line 1,800 feet from the mansion at 9:23 a.m. on that May morning. Isaiah had stood watching until the wagon was no longer visible, and in those 7 minutes and 30 seconds of watching, he had made several calculations. The Thornhill mansion was worth approximately $18,000. The plantation's 400 acres were worth approximately $32,000. Colonel Thornhill owned 34 enslaved people worth a total of approximately $21,000. Burning everything would cost Thornhill at least $71,000 plus the crops in the field and equipment in the barns. And Isaiah would rather die burning Thornhill's world to ashes than live one more day serving the man who had sold his family. The challenge was executing the plan without getting caught before the fire started and without killing anyone except possibly Colonel Thornhill and his immediate family. Isaiah had no desire to murder the other enslaved people on the plantation or the household servants who had no role in selling Martha and the children. This requirement meant the fire needed to start late at night, when people were either asleep in quarters away from the main house or had time to escape once they noticed the flames. It also meant Isaiah needed to ensure that the fire spread so quickly and completely that Thornhill couldn't salvage anything valuable, particularly the plantation's financial records and cotton crop receipts stored in the colonel's office safe. Isaiah had spent June and July studying how fire traveled through the mansion by carefully observing how candles and oil lamps created heat patterns, how drafts moved through the building's ventilation system, where smoke accumulated and where it dispersed. He learned that the mansion's central staircase acted like a chimney, pulling air from the first floor to the third floor at a rate that would accelerate any fire starting on the lower levels. He learned that the mansion's walls contained air gaps between the exterior boards and interior plaster, creating channels where fire could spread horizontally while remaining hidden until it burst through in multiple locations simultaneously. August and September were spent collecting materials and preparing the accelerants. Isaiah rendered fat from every animal butchered for the household: pigs, chickens, cows, sheep, claiming he needed large quantities for soap making to prepare for winter. The Thornhills approved this explanation because soap was expensive to purchase, and making it in-house saved approximately $15 per year. Isaiah mixed the rendered fat with cotton scraps from discarded clothing and bedding, creating dense blocks that would burn intensely once ignited. He tested his formula in small quantities behind the kitchen house, discovering that a piece the size of a walnut would burn for 8–10 minutes, with flames hot enough to ignite dry wood, and that the fat would liquefy as it burned, spreading fire to any surface it dripped onto. He calculated that 47 pounds of this material distributed throughout the mansion would create at least 200 separate ignition points, and that once the fire started, the mansion would be fully engulfed within 40 to 45 minutes. Too fast for bucket brigades to contain, and too widespread for any organized firefighting response. October was spent placing the accelerants in their final positions. Isaiah had access to every room in the mansion as head butler. His duties included supervising household cleaning, managing the dining room service, and ensuring that the colonel's personal quarters remained properly maintained. This access allowed him to work systematically through the building over 4 weeks, placing accelerant blocks in strategic locations while performing his normal cleaning routines. He put 8 blocks in the attic spaces above the 3rd floor, 12 blocks inside wall cavities on the 2nd floor, 15 blocks under floorboards on the 1st floor, and 12 blocks in the basement where the mansion's support beams would burn and cause structural collapse. Each block was wrapped in cotton fabric that would prevent the fat from melting prematurely in Alabama's heat and would provide additional fuel once ignition occurred. Isaiah marked the locations of each block in a notebook using a simple code, room numbers and furniture positions that would mean nothing to anyone else, but would allow Isaiah to remember exactly where each accelerant was hidden. The final element of the plan required timing. Isaiah needed the mansion to burn on a night when he had legitimate reason to be awake and moving through the building, when the Thornhill family and their guests would be distracted or asleep, and when wind conditions would spread the fire efficiently without endangering the slave quarters located 300 feet east of the mansion. Isaiah had been monitoring wind patterns for months and had noticed that November typically brought westerly winds averaging 8–12 miles per hour, strong enough to fan flames, but not so strong that embers would travel dangerously far from the mansion. He chose November 8, 1859, because the Thornhills were hosting a major dinner party that evening celebrating the colonel's 50th birthday, a party that would keep household staff working late, would leave the family and guests exhausted and slow to respond to danger, and would provide Isaiah with perfect cover to move through the mansion, making final preparations, while everyone assumed he was managing the dinner service. The dinner party began at 7 p.m., with 40 guests arriving in carriages and on horseback, filling the mansion's main hall and spilling into the dining room where tables had been set for a meal that Isaiah and the kitchen staff had spent 3 days preparing. Isaiah supervised the service of 7 courses over 4 hours. Oyster soup, roasted quail, beef tenderloin, ham with sweet potatoes, 3 types of vegetables, biscuits with butter, and apple pie with cream. He ensured that wine flowed continuously, that Colonel Thornhill's glass never emptied, that the guests were so well attended and so thoroughly fed that they would be sluggish and drowsy by the time the party concluded. The meal cost approximately $180 in food and wine, enough to feed the 34 enslaved people on the plantation for 3 months. And Isaiah took grim satisfaction in serving it, knowing that this would be the last meal ever eaten in the Thornhill mansion. At 11:23 p.m., the last guests departed, and the Thornhill family retired to their bedrooms. Colonel Marcus Thornhill and his wife Elizabeth to the master bedroom on the 2nd floor's east wing. Their 3 adult children to rooms on the 2nd and 3rd floors. The household staff began cleaning the dining room and kitchen, a process that typically took 90 minutes and would leave everyone exhausted by 1 a.m. Isaiah supervised the cleaning while making his final preparations, moving through the mansion ostensibly to ensure that candles were extinguished and that the house was secured for the night. What he actually did during this tour was check each of his 47 accelerant locations to verify that none had been discovered, that cotton wadding remained dry and ready to ignite, and that the ignition sequence he had planned would work as designed. The ignition method Isaiah had developed was simple but effective. A cotton cord soaked in lamp oil, stretched through the mansion's interior spaces, connecting multiple accelerant blocks in a network that would allow fire to spread simultaneously to different areas of the building. Isaiah had been placing these cords over the past week, running them through wall cavities and under floorboards where they wouldn't be visible, but would remain accessible for lighting. The main cord started in the basement, ran up through the walls to the 1st floor, branched into 3 separate strands that ran to the 2nd and 3rd floors, and terminated at accelerant blocks that would ignite within 15 to 20 seconds of the cord being lit. Once the accelerants began burning, the fire would spread to the building's structural wood within 3 to 4 minutes and would become uncontrollable within 10 to 12 minutes. Isaiah's calculations suggested that the mansion would be fully engulfed within 45 minutes and would collapse completely within 2 hours. At 1:17 a.m. on November 9, 1859, the mansion was quiet. The cleaning was complete, the household staff had retired to their quarters, the Thornhill family was asleep. Isaiah stood in the basement with a candle in his hand and the end of his cotton cord fuse lying on the floor at his feet. He had thought about this moment for 6 months, had prepared every detail, had calculated every consequence. He knew that what he was about to do would be classified as arson and possibly murder, that he would be hunted and probably killed if captured, that he would never see Martha or his children again, regardless of whether his plan succeeded. But he also knew that Colonel Thornhill had destroyed Isaiah's family without hesitation or remorse, had treated Isaiah's wife and children as property worth $200 rather than as human beings, and deserved to lose everything, just as Isaiah had lost everything. Isaiah bent down and touched the candle flame to the cotton cord. The cord caught immediately, burning at approximately 2 inches per second, creating a small moving point of light that raced across the basement floor and up into the wall cavity. Isaiah didn't wait to watch. He had 60 seconds to get out of the basement and another 120 seconds to get clear of the mansion before the first accelerant blocks would ignite. He climbed the basement stairs 2 at a time, moved through the 1st floor hallway toward the rear door that led to the kitchen house, and was 40 feet from the mansion when he heard the first muffled whump of accelerant igniting inside the walls. He kept walking, not running because running would draw attention, moving steadily toward the slave quarters where he needed to wake people and get them clear before the fire spread. Behind him, inside the mansion's walls, Fire was beginning to spread through the carefully prepared network of accelerants, creating a web of flame that no one could see, but that would soon explode into every room simultaneously. Isaiah reached the slave quarters at 1:19 a.m. and began pounding on doors, shouting for people to wake up and get out. "Fire in the big house," he yelled, using the urgency in his voice to overcome the confusion of people being woken from sleep. "Everyone out now. Move toward the east field." The quarters held 34 people in 8 separate cabins, and Isaiah moved from door to door, ensuring that everyone was awake and moving, particularly the elderly and the children who were slower to respond. Some people asked questions. What happened? Where's the fire? Should they try to help? But Isaiah cut them off. "Just move," he commanded. "Get to the east field and stay there." By 1:23 a.m., approximately 4 minutes after Isaiah had lit the fuse, all 34 enslaved people were moving away from the quarters toward the open field that served as a buffer between the plantation's work areas and the cotton fields. The first visible flames appeared at 1:24 a.m. when fire broke through the first-floor windows on the mansion's north side, creating sudden bright rectangles of orange light that reflected off the white columns and illuminated the front lawn. The flames spread laterally along the first floor with shocking speed as the accelerant blocks ignited in sequence, each one adding heat and fuel to fires that merged and grew until the entire first floor was glowing from within. Isaiah stood in the east field with the other enslaved people, watching the mansion transform from a sleeping building into a pillar of flame. Someone asked if they should try to save the family. Isaiah shook his head. "It's too late," he said, which was true. By 1:26 a.m., the fire had spread to the second floor, and the mansion's central staircase was acting as a chimney, pulling flames upward at a rate that would engulf the upper floors within minutes. At 1:27 a.m., Colonel Thornhill's bedroom window shattered from the heat, and Isaiah saw figures moving behind the window. Marcus and Elizabeth Thornhill attempting to escape through smoke that was filling the second floor. The colonel appeared at the window, his nightshirt visible in the firelight, and began shouting for help. Isaiah could hear him, but couldn't make out the words over the roar of the fire, which had grown so loud it sounded like wind tearing through trees during a storm. Thornhill disappeared back into the smoke, presumably trying to reach his children in the other bedrooms, and Isaiah never saw him again. The second-floor windows began shattering in sequence as heat built up inside the rooms. North wing at 1:28 a.m., south wing at 1:29 a.m., east wing at 1:30 a.m. Each explosion of glass accompanied by flames that burst outward and upward, seeking oxygen and finding the third floor above. The third floor ignited at 1:32 a.m., exactly 15 minutes after Isaiah had lit the basement fuse. Fire erupted from windows simultaneously on all 4 sides of the mansion, creating a crown of flame that rose 40 feet above the roofline and illuminated the plantation with light, bright enough to read by. The heat was intense enough that Isaiah and the others in the east field, now 400 feet from the burning mansion, could feel it on their faces, like standing too close to a forge. The mansion's roof began to fail at 1:34 a.m., when the support beams in the attic burned through and the slate shingles collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks 100 feet into the air. The white columns on the mansion's front facade were now black with soot and beginning to burn from the inside, where Isaiah's accelerants had weakened their structural integrity. At 1:36 a.m., one of the northern columns buckled and fell, crashing onto the front steps and sending up a plume of embers that drifted on the westerly wind toward the kitchen house. Isaiah watched the kitchen house catch fire at 1:38 a.m., not from his plan, but from embers landing on its wooden roof. The kitchen house went up fast because it was full of dried wood, stored food, and the remaining cooking fat that Isaiah hadn't used for his accelerants. Within 4 minutes, the kitchen house was fully involved, adding to the inferno that now covered approximately 8,000 square feet and generated heat that could be felt half a mile away. The barn complex located 200 feet west of the mansion caught next, igniting at 1:44 a.m. when embers landed on hay stored in the loft. The barns contained the plantation's work equipment, stored cotton from the previous harvest, and 6 horses that someone had forgotten to release. Isaiah heard the horses screaming and felt a moment of genuine regret. He hadn't intended to kill animals. But there was no way to reach the barns now, no way to undo what he had started. By 2 a.m., approximately 43 minutes after Isaiah had lit the fuse, the Thornhill mansion was a roaring shell of a building with no roof, no upper floors, and walls that were beginning to collapse inward as the support structure failed. Isaiah counted approximately 17 people who had emerged from the mansion and surrounding buildings. Servants, household staff, possibly some family members who had somehow found a way out despite the speed of the fire's spread. He didn't see Colonel Thornhill or his wife, didn't see any of their 3 children, and calculated that at least 5 members of the Thornhill family had died in the fire. This wasn't murder in his mind. It was justice delivered through flame, payment for the destruction of his own family, a settling of accounts that the law would never provide. But it also meant that Isaiah was now guilty of killing white people, which in Alabama in 1859 was a crime punishable by public execution, probably by burning at the stake to match his method of killing. The plantation's overseer, a man named Robert Hayes, who lived in a cottage 600 feet south of the mansion, arrived at the scene at 2:04 a.m. after being woken by the sound of collapsing timbers. Hayes immediately began questioning people about how the fire started, who had seen it first, whether anyone had been inside when it began. Isaiah had prepared for this interrogation and gave Hayes the same story he had given the others. He had been in his room in the servants' quarters behind the mansion when he heard glass breaking, had gone to investigate, had seen flames inside the mansion's first floor, and immediately started waking people to evacuate. Hayes asked if Isaiah had seen Colonel Thornhill or any family members escape. Isaiah said he had seen figures at the second-floor windows, but had been too far away to identify them. Hayes asked if anyone had tried to rescue the family. Isaiah pointed out that the fire had spread too quickly for rescue attempts to be safe, which was true even if it was also by design. At 2:17 a.m., the mansion's front facade collapsed, sending the 3 remaining columns crashing down onto the front lawn and creating a cloud of sparks and ash that rose 200 feet into the air. The collapse exposed the mansion's interior, revealing 3 floors of burning rooms now reduced to a single mass of flaming debris piled 15 feet high. The heat from this pile was so intense that it continued burning without any additional fuel, consuming itself through sheer accumulated thermal energy. Isaiah calculated that the fire would burn at high intensity for another 3 to 4 hours before cooling enough that people could approach the remains, and that by that time, nothing would be left except brick chimneys, stone foundation walls, and perhaps some iron fittings from doors and windows. Everything else, the furniture, the family's possessions, the plantation's financial records, Colonel Thornhill's safe, the artwork and silver and china that represented generations of accumulated wealth, would be reduced to ash. At 3 a.m., Isaiah made his decision to run. The fire was still burning but no longer required his attention. The overseer was focused on trying to organize bucket brigades that were obviously futile, and the chaos of the night would provide cover for his departure. He walked calmly to the slave quarters, retrieved his tin box containing $340, and began walking east into the darkness, following a route he had memorized during 6 months of planning. He knew that by sunrise, someone would notice he was missing and would connect his disappearance to the fire's suspicious origin. He knew that slave catchers would be hired and would pursue him with dogs. He knew that his chances of reaching free territory were less than 30%, and that capture would mean torture and execution. But he also knew that he would rather die running toward freedom than live another day serving people who saw him as property. Behind him, the Thornhill mansion burned down to its foundation, taking with it $18,000 in building value, $32,000 in land value that would plummet without the mansion, and 5 members of the Thornhill family. Isaiah walked into the darkness without looking back. November 9th, 1859, 6:47 a.m. Isaiah Webb had covered approximately 11 miles since leaving the Thornhill plantation at 3 a.m., moving through dense Alabama forest at a pace that averaged just under 3 miles per hour in complete darkness. His route followed a creek bed that ran northeast toward the Tombigbee River, using the water to mask his scent from tracking dogs and the natural depression of the creek valley to stay hidden from anyone searching the main roads. The temperature had dropped to 43 degrees Fahrenheit during the pre-dawn hours, cold enough that Isaiah's breath created visible fog, and his hands had gone numb from gripping tree branches to maintain balance on the slippery creek bank. He had $340 in his tin box, a knife he had taken from the plantation kitchen, 3 days' worth of dried food wrapped in cloth, and approximately 18 hours before Robert Hayes would organize a proper search party with dogs and experienced trackers. Isaiah's plan was to reach the Tombigbee River by nightfall, follow it north for 40 miles to the town of Demopolis, and find transportation on a riverboat heading toward free territory. A journey of approximately 600 miles that would take at least 3 weeks if nothing went wrong, and considerably longer if slave catchers picked up his trail. Behind him, the ruins of Thornhill Plantation were still smoldering. The mansion's brick chimneys stood like tombstones above a 20-foot wide pile of ash and charred timbers that covered the building's 6,000 square foot footprint. The kitchen house had burned completely, leaving only its stone foundation. The barn complex was a total loss. 3 structures reduced to ash, 6 horses dead, equipment destroyed. Investigators who examined the scene at first light counted 7 bodies in the mansion's remains. Colonel Marcus Thornhill, his wife Elizabeth, their 3 adult children, and 2 household servants who had been sleeping on the 3rd floor when fire consumed the upper stories. The bodies were burned beyond recognition, identifiable only by their locations within the ruins and by jewelry or personal items that survived the fire. The total death count from Isaiah's fire was 13 when including the horses, making it the deadliest arson incident in Clark County's history and one of the most destructive acts of slave resistance ever documented in Alabama. Robert Hayes organized the initial search at 8:30 a.m. on November 9th after confirming that Isaiah was missing and after finding evidence in the mansion's basement that pointed to deliberate arson. The evidence included remnants of cotton cord that hadn't completely burned, traces of animal fat in wall cavities that had survived the fire, and a pattern of burn damage that suggested multiple simultaneous ignition points rather than a single accidental fire. Hayes was 38 years old, had worked as overseer at Thornhill Plantation for 9 years, and understood immediately that Isaiah's disappearance combined with evidence of arson meant the head butler had murdered the Thornhill family and fled. Hayes sent riders to notify neighboring plantations, the county sheriff in Grove Hill 14 miles away, and professional slave catchers who operated throughout southern Alabama. The reward Hayes offered for Isaiah's capture was $500 alive or $200 dead, a substantial sum that reflected both Isaiah's value as skilled labor and the severity of his crime. The first search party departed Thornhill Plantation at 11:15 a.m. with 6 men, 4 dogs, and enough supplies for a 3-day pursuit. The dogs picked up Isaiah's scent immediately from clothing in his quarters and tracked it to the creek bed where Isaiah had begun his escape. The creek presented a tracking problem because moving through water eliminated scent trails, but the lead tracker a man named Sullivan, who had captured 47 fugitive slaves over 12 years, understood that people following creeks eventually had to emerge onto dry land. Sullivan divided his party into two groups. 3 men with 2 dogs, following the creek downstream toward the southwest. 3 men with 2 dogs following the creek upstream toward the northeast. This strategy assumed Isaiah had chosen one direction or the other, rather than crossing the creek and traveling overland, which was a reasonable assumption, given that overland travel through dense forest would be slower and more difficult than following the natural pathway of the creek valley. Isaiah had anticipated this search strategy, which was why his route followed the creek for only 8 miles before veering overland toward a secondary creek that ran parallel to the first, but was separated by 3 miles of forest. The overland section was brutal. Thick undergrowth, fallen trees, darkness that made every step uncertain. But it broke his trail in a way that would force the tracking dogs to search a much wider area. Isaiah reached the secondary creek at 7:30 a.m., 4 hours and 30 minutes after leaving the plantation, and resumed following water northeast toward the Tombigbee River. He moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, knowing that every mile he gained before the search party found his trail increased his chances of escape. His hands were bleeding from gripping rough tree bark, his feet were soaked from walking in creek water, and his legs burned from constant uphill and downhill movement. But he maintained his pace because stopping meant capture, and capture meant death. The search party's downstream group found nothing after following the creek for 6 miles and returned to the plantation at 3:20 p.m. The upstream group tracked Isaiah's scent for 8 miles before losing it completely at the point where he had left the creek to travel overland. Sullivan examined the area carefully and found crushed undergrowth indicating that someone had moved through the forest heading northeast. But without a scent trail, the dogs couldn't follow. Sullivan made a decision. Isaiah was heading toward the Tombigbee River, probably planning to follow it north toward Demopolis or beyond. The tracker sent riders ahead to Demopolis with descriptions of Isaiah and instructions to watch for a tall black man traveling alone without papers. And he organized his search party to move directly overland toward the river, cutting across the forest rather than following Isaiah's winding route. This strategy would allow the searchers to potentially intercept Isaiah at the river rather than tracking him step by step through the forest. Isaiah reached the Tombigbee River at 6:15 p.m. on November 9th, approximately 15 hours after leaving Thornhill Plantation and having covered roughly 23 miles through difficult terrain. The river was approximately 200 feet wide at this point, flowing south at an estimated 3 miles per hour, brown with sediment from recent rain upstream. Isaiah followed the eastern bank north, staying in the tree line where he would be less visible to anyone traveling on the river or its banks. He saw 2 riverboats heading south during the first hour, a paddle wheel steamer carrying passengers and a flatboat loaded with cotton bales. But he let them pass without attempting to signal or approach them. His plan required reaching Demopolis, where river traffic was more frequent and where he had a better chance of finding a boat whose crew might be willing to transport a fugitive slave for money rather than turning him in for the reward. The second night of Isaiah's escape was colder than the first, temperature dropping to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, wind picking up from the north, bringing the smell of coming rain. Isaiah didn't risk a fire because smoke would be visible for miles and would draw searchers directly to his location. He ate dried meat and cornbread while walking, maintaining movement to generate body heat, covering approximately 15 more miles before exhaustion forced him to rest in a hollowed-out space beneath the roots of a fallen tree. He slept for 3 hours, from 11:30 p.m. to 2:30 a.m., then resumed walking despite his body screaming for more rest. By dawn on November 10th, Isaiah had covered approximately 38 miles from Thornhill Plantation and was within 10 miles of Demopolis. He could smell the town before he could see it. wood smoke from hundreds of chimneys, the sharper smell of industrial activity from the sawmills that operated along the river and underlying everything, the distinctive odor of a town with 2,000 people and inadequate sanitation. Sullivan's search party reached the Tombigbee River at 9:30 a.m. on November 10th, approximately 15 hours behind Isaiah and 27 miles south of his current position. Sullivan had correctly predicted Isaiah's route and had moved his party quickly through the forest. But he had also underestimated how fast Isaiah would travel through difficult terrain. The tracker examined the riverbank and found footprints indicating that someone had been following the bank northward within the past 12 hours. The prints were partially obscured by rain that had started falling at 4 a.m., but Sullivan could still identify them as belonging to a man of Isaiah's approximate height and weight, based on stride length and depth of impression. The search party continued north along the river, moving faster now that they were on relatively clear ground rather than fighting through forest undergrowth. Isaiah entered the outskirts of Demopolis at 10:45 a.m. on November 10th, moving carefully through the town's edge where free black people and enslaved workers congregated at warehouses and loading docks serving the river trade. He needed to find a riverboat captain who would transport him north for money. But approaching the wrong captain would result in immediate capture. Most riverboat operators were sympathetic to slavery and would turn in fugitives for reward money rather than risk legal penalties for aiding escape. Isaiah spent 90 minutes observing the docks from a concealed position in a warehouse district, watching how different crews interacted with black dock workers, listening to conversations that might indicate which boats might be receptive to his approach. He identified 3 possibilities: a small cargo boat with a crew of 4 men who seemed relatively indifferent to the black workers around them, a passenger steamer whose captain was engaged in animated argument with a local sheriff about some regulation, and a private yacht that appeared to be provisioning for a long journey north. Isaiah approached the cargo boat first, waiting until the crew was loading cargo and the captain was distracted with paperwork. He caught the attention of one of the crew members, a white man in his 20s who was supervising the loading, and asked in a low voice if the boat was heading north and whether they needed additional crew. The crew member looked at Isaiah with suspicion. A well-dressed black man appearing at the docks without an owner or papers was obviously a fugitive, and shook his head. "We don't take passengers," he said, "and we definitely don't take runaways. You need to move along before the captain sees you." Isaiah thanked him and withdrew, crossing the cargo boat off his list. He tried the passenger steamer next, approaching a different crew member with a more direct proposal. "I need to get to Tennessee. I have money to pay for passage." This time, the response was immediate and hostile. "You got papers?" the crew member demanded. Isaiah shook his head. "Then you're not getting on this boat. Sheriff." The crew member started to call for the sheriff, who was still arguing with the captain, and Isaiah walked away quickly before the situation escalated. The third option, the private yacht, was Isaiah's last hope before he would need to try traveling overland away from the river, where search parties would be less concentrated. The yacht was approximately 40 feet long, built for speed rather than cargo capacity, with a crew of 3 men who appeared to be preparing for departure. Isaiah watched them for 30 minutes from his concealed position and noticed something unusual. One of the crew members was black, which was uncommon on private vessels where owners typically preferred white crews for status reasons. This detail suggested that the yacht's owner might be less conventional in his attitudes about race, or at least more pragmatic about hiring competent crew regardless of color. Isaiah decided to risk direct approach, waiting until the owner, a well-dressed white man in his 50s, emerged from the yacht's cabin and stood alone on the deck reviewing a chart. Isaiah walked directly to the yacht's boarding plank and called up to the owner. "Sir, I'm looking for passage north. I can pay." The owner looked down at Isaiah with the sharp assessment of someone who had seen many things in his life and wasn't easily surprised. "You're a runaway," the owner stated flatly. It wasn't a question. Isaiah nodded. "From where?" the owner asked. Isaiah made a quick calculation. If this man was going to turn him in, he'd already have called for the sheriff, and answering questions might build enough rapport to make passage possible. "Clark County, Thornhill Plantation. You might have heard about a fire." The owner's eyebrows rose slightly. "I heard about that fire. Heard 7 people died. Heard they're offering $500 for whoever set it." He paused. "That you?" Isaiah nodded again. "It was me. I have reasons." The owner studied Isaiah for a long moment, then made a decision that would save Isaiah's life. "I'm Charles Brennan," he said. "I'm a shipping merchant from Boston. I come south twice a year to buy cotton, and I go north to sell it. I think slavery is evil. I think people who own slaves are criminals. And I think anyone who kills slavers is doing God's work, even if the law disagrees." He gestured toward the yacht's cabin. "Get on board. We leave in 20 minutes. Passage to Tennessee will cost you $100, and if anyone asks, you're a free black man I hired as crew and mobile." Isaiah climbed aboard at 1:17 p.m. on November 10th, exactly 34 hours after he had lit the fuse in the Thornhill Mansion's basement. He paid Brennan $100 from his tin box, leaving him with $240 for the journey ahead, and disappeared into the yacht's cargo hold where Brennan indicated he should stay hidden until they were well clear of Demopolis. Sullivan's search party reached Demopolis at 2:30 p.m. on November 10th, approximately 73 minutes after Isaiah had boarded Brennan's yacht. Sullivan went directly to the dockmaster's office and began questioning everyone who had seen a tall black man without papers in the past few hours. He found 3 witnesses. The cargo boat crew member who confirmed he had turned away a fugitive at approximately 11:30 a.m. The passenger steamer crew member who had tried to call the sheriff at approximately 12:15 p.m. and a dock worker who had seen a black man boarding a private yacht at approximately 1:15 p.m. Sullivan focused on the yacht. Learning from the dockmaster that it was owned by Charles Brennan of Boston, that it had departed at 1:35 p.m. heading north toward Tennessee, and that it was a fast vessel capable of maintaining 8 to 10 miles per hour in good conditions, Sullivan calculated. The yacht had an 85-minute head start and was traveling approximately 3 times faster than his search party could move along the riverbank. Catching it would require a faster boat or coordination with authorities further upriver who could intercept it. Sullivan sent urgent messages to sheriffs and slave catchers in 3 towns upriver from Demopolis: Eaps, 40 miles north; Gainesville, 70 miles north; and Coffeyville, 95 miles north. The messages described Isaiah, described Brennan's yacht, and offered to split the $500 reward with anyone who captured Isaiah or detained Brennan for investigation. Sullivan then commandeered a small steam-powered patrol boat operated by customs officials and began pursuit at 4:15 p.m., approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes behind Isaiah's yacht. The patrol boat could travel at 12 miles per hour in good conditions, faster than Brennan's yacht, which meant Sullivan would close the distance over time and would likely overtake the yacht somewhere between Ypres and Gainesville if Brennan didn't increase speed or take evasive action. Charles Brennan was an experienced river traveler who had been navigating the Tombigbee for 8 years and understood exactly what would happen once slave catchers learned Isaiah was aboard his yacht. Brennan called Isaiah from the cargo hold at 5:30 p.m. and explained the situation. Pursuit was inevitable. Overtaking was likely within 12-18 hours. And when the patrol boat caught up, customs officials would board and search the yacht thoroughly. Isaiah's only chance was to disembark before the pursuit caught up and continue his escape overland, while Brennan drew the searchers away by continuing upriver. Brennan proposed dropping Isaiah at a specific location 15 miles north of Demopolis, where the river passed through uninhabited swampland, where there would be no witnesses to the disembarkation, and where Isaiah could travel overland northeast toward Mississippi rather than continuing upriver into increased law enforcement presence. Isaiah accepted Brennan's plan and disembarked at 7:45 p.m. on November 10th, at a bend in the river surrounded by cypress swamp, standing waist-deep in cold black water, while Brennan's yacht continued north, carrying decoy cargo that would satisfy searchers that no one had left the vessel. Isaiah watched the yacht disappear around the next bend, its navigation lights fading into darkness, and then turned east into swampland that stretched for approximately 8 miles before transitioning to drier forest. The swamp was treacherous. Standing water concealed sinkholes, submerged logs, and water moccasins that were difficult to see in darkness. But it also provided excellent concealment and would eliminate any scent trail that tracking dogs might follow. Isaiah moved slowly through the swamp for 6 hours, covering perhaps 4 miles in conditions that would have been impossible to navigate without the specific knowledge of swamp travel he had gained during his 34 years living in Alabama's lowlands. Sullivan's patrol boat overtook Brennan's yacht at 3:20 a.m. on November 11th, approximately 85 miles north of Demopolis, and 7 hours after Isaiah had disembarked. Sullivan boarded with 3 armed deputies and conducted a thorough search that included the cargo hold, the crew quarters, the storage compartments, and even the yacht's small boat stored on deck. They found no fugitive slave. Sullivan questioned Brennan aggressively for 40 minutes, demanding to know where Isaiah had gone, threatening charges for aiding a fugitive, suggesting that Brennan's anti-slavery statements in Demopolis had been reported to authorities. Brennan maintained that he had indeed hired a black man in Demopolis, but that the man had disembarked in Ypres, a town they had passed approximately 5 hours earlier, claiming he wanted to find work at the sawmills there. Sullivan didn't believe this story but had no evidence to contradict it. No way to prove that Isaiah hadn't disembarked where Brennan claimed, and no legal basis to detain Brennan longer without charges. Sullivan released the yacht at 4:05 a.m. and returned to Ypres to begin searching there, effectively sending the search party 45 miles in the wrong direction, while Isaiah continued northeast through Mississippi swampland. Isaiah emerged from the swamp at 2:00 a.m. on November 11th, covered in mud and exhausted from 12 hours of continuous movement through water and vegetation. He had covered approximately 12 miles from his disembarkation point and was now in relatively dry forest where travel would be easier, but exposure to discovery would be higher. He found a hollow tree and slept for 4 hours, then resumed traveling northeast toward the Mississippi-Alabama border, a distance of approximately 30 miles that he hoped to cover in 2 days. His food was running low, 1 day's worth of dried meat and cornbread remaining, and his $240 would be useless until he reached a town where he could purchase supplies without drawing attention. The next 48 hours would be critical. Either he would put enough distance between himself and the search parties to have a realistic chance of reaching free territory, or he would be caught and killed. The search for Isaiah continued for another 11 days after Sullivan lost his trail at Ypres. Slave catchers searched a 200-square-mile area around Demopolis, questioned dozens of river travelers, and pursued false sightings from Ypres to Gainesville to Coffeyville. Robert Hayes increased the reward to $750 on November 15th when it became clear that Isaiah had successfully escaped the immediate area. Newspapers across Alabama printed descriptions of Isaiah and details of the Thornhill Mansion fire, creating the most extensive manhunt for a fugitive slave in Alabama history since Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Despite these efforts, no confirmed sightings of Isaiah occurred after November 10th when he boarded Brennan's yacht in Demopolis. Isaiah crossed into Mississippi on November 13, 1859. Traveling through sparsely populated forest and swampland, where he encountered few people and could avoid roads where slave patrols operated. He purchased food and supplies in the town of Wahalak on November 16th. Posing as a free black man traveling to find work in Memphis and presenting forged papers that he created himself using paper and ink purchased from a general store. The forgery was crude but effective for the brief inspection it received from the suspicious shopkeeper, who sold him cornmeal, salt pork, and a blanket. Isaiah continued northeast through Mississippi for another 8 days, covering approximately 120 miles total from the Alabama border to the Tennessee state line, which he crossed on November 24, 1859, exactly 16 days after burning down the Thornhill Mansion. Tennessee provided slightly better conditions for fugitive slaves than Alabama or Mississippi. There were more free black communities, more underground railroad stations, and enforcement of fugitive slave laws was less aggressive in the state's northern regions. Isaiah made contact with Underground Railroad operators in Jackson, Tennessee on November 28th after being directed to them by a free black woman who operated a boarding house. The operators provided shelter, food, and guidance for the next phase of his journey. 240 miles north to the Ohio River, then across into free territory in Illinois or Indiana. Isaiah stayed in Jackson for 3 days, recovering from the physical toll of 20 days of continuous travel, then departed on December 1st with 2 other fugitives heading toward the same destination. The journey from Jackson, Tennessee to the Ohio River took 18 days through increasingly cold weather. Temperatures dropping into the 20s Fahrenheit at night, occasional snow that made travel more difficult, but also obscured tracks. Isaiah and his traveling companions moved through a network of safe houses operated by Quaker families, free black communities, and anti-slavery whites who risked legal penalties to assist fugitives. They crossed into Kentucky on December 11th, traveled along the Ohio River's southern bank for 4 days, avoiding river patrols, and finally crossed the river into Illinois on December 19, 1859, using a small boat operated by an Underground Railroad conductor. Isaiah stepped onto Illinois soil at 2:30 a.m. on December 19th, exactly 40 days after lighting the fuse that destroyed the Thornhill Mansion. He was free. Isaiah settled initially in Cairo, Illinois, a river town at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, with a substantial free black population of approximately 400 people. He found work as a carpenter using skills he had learned during his years at Thornhill Plantation, earning $1.50 per day, approximately half what white carpenters earned, but enough to support himself while maintaining a low profile. He changed his name to Isaiah Freeman, claiming the surname with deliberate irony, and created a false history claiming he had been born free in Kentucky and had moved to Illinois seeking better work opportunities. This fabrication was thin, but sufficient for a town where many residents preferred not to ask detailed questions about black residents' origins. The pursuit of Isaiah ended officially on January 3, 1860, when Robert Hayes closed the investigation after spending $750 on search parties, rewards, and travel expenses without recovering Isaiah or obtaining any confirmed information about his location. Hayes reported to the Thornhill Estate's executor that Isaiah had likely died during his escape, either killed by exposure, drowned crossing a river, or killed by vigilantes who had found him but didn't report it to claim the reward. This conclusion was convenient for Hayes because it ended the expensive search while protecting his reputation as overseer. Admitting that a slave had successfully escaped after murdering the plantation's owners would have damaged Hayes's ability to find future employment. The Thornhill estate was settled over 6 months, with the property sold at auction for approximately $22,000, less than half its pre-fire value. The 34 enslaved people who survived the fire were sold to various buyers, scattering them across Alabama and Mississippi with no record of what happened to them subsequently. Isaiah lived in Cairo until April 1861, when the outbreak of the Civil War transformed the situation for fugitive slaves throughout the border states. The Union Army's policy of accepting fugitive slaves as contraband of war, rather than returning them to Southern owners, created unprecedented opportunities for formerly enslaved people to gain legal protection and employment. Isaiah enlisted in the Union Army on June 15, 1861, joining the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry as a private soldier earning $10 per month. He served in 7 engagements between 1861 and 1863, was promoted to corporal in October 1862 after demonstrating leadership during the Battle of Island Mound in Missouri, and was discharged honorably in March 1864 after receiving a leg wound that ended his combat service. After military service, Isaiah moved to Chicago, where he worked as a carpenter and labor organizer, helping other formerly enslaved people find employment and housing. He married in 1866 to a woman named Sarah Johnson, a former slave from Virginia who had escaped via the Underground Railroad in 1858. They had 4 children between 1867 and 1874. Isaiah never spoke publicly about the Thornhill Mansion fire, maintaining his false identity as a man born free in Kentucky. But he did write a detailed account of the events in a private journal that he kept hidden until his death. The journal was discovered in 1923, 14 years after Isaiah died in Chicago at age 84 on March 7, 1909. The journal's discovery created significant historical interest because it provided the only detailed first-person account of the Thornhill Mansion fire. Historians verified Isaiah's story by comparing his descriptions to newspaper reports from 1859, to legal records from the Thornhill estate settlement, and to physical evidence from the mansion's ruins that had been preserved and later examined. The verification confirmed that Isaiah had indeed deliberately burned the mansion using rendered animal fat and cotton wadding, that 7 people had died in the fire, and that his escape had been as meticulously planned as his arson. The journal also revealed Isaiah's calculations about fire spread rates, his technical knowledge of building construction, and his moral reasoning about the fire. He never expressed regret for killing the Thornhills, but did express sorrow for the horses that died and for the household servants who were killed. The Thornhill Plantation site in Clark County, Alabama, was never rebuilt. A historical marker was installed at the site in 1998 by the Alabama Historical Association, describing the fire as one of the most significant acts of resistance during the slavery era, and noting that Isaiah Webb Freeman had successfully escaped despite one of the largest manhunts in Alabama history. Modern analysis of Isaiah's arson technique by fire investigation experts has confirmed that his method was remarkably sophisticated for someone with no formal training in chemistry or engineering. The use of rendered animal fat as an accelerant was particularly effective because fat burns at temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite structural wood, and liquefies as it burns, allowing it to spread fire to surfaces that wouldn't normally ignite from radiant heat alone. The distribution of accelerant blocks throughout the building created a pattern that modern arson investigators call distributed ignition. Multiple simultaneous fires that overwhelm firefighting response and ensure total destruction. This technique wasn't documented in arson investigation manuals until the 1920s, meaning Isaiah had independently developed a method that wouldn't be formally recognized for another 60 years. The total impact of Isaiah's arson can be quantified. 7 deaths, 5 Thornhill family members, 2 servants, 6 horses killed, $18,000 mansion destroyed, $8,000 in barn and equipment losses, $3,000 in stored cotton destroyed, estimated $32,000 in land value depreciation due to loss of improvements, $750 in search expenses, and unmeasured psychological impact on other plantation owners who recognized that their own enslaved workers might possess similar capabilities for resistance. The fire directly contributed to the Thornhill family's complete financial ruin, and indirectly affected 34 enslaved people who were sold and scattered after the fire. Isaiah's successful escape demonstrated that careful planning and technical knowledge could overcome the enormous structural advantages that slaveholders possessed in terms of legal authority, resources, and tracking capabilities. Isaiah Freeman's journal is preserved at the Chicago History Museum in a climate-controlled archive. The journal contains 87 pages describing his life at Thornhill Plantation, his decision to commit arson, his technical preparations, the fire itself, his escape, and his subsequent life in Illinois. Researchers studying the journal have identified it as one of the most detailed first-person accounts of slave resistance through property destruction. And several historians have argued that Isaiah's methods influenced other acts of arson resistance during the late 1850s and early 1860s. The journal was published in edited form in 1967 under the title Fire and Freedom, The Thornhill Arson of 1859, and has been cited in 43 scholarly works on slavery, resistance, and the Civil War era. Isaiah Freeman died in Chicago on March 7, 1909, at age 84. His obituary in the Chicago Defender described him as a Civil War veteran and labor organizer, with no mention of his role in the Thornhill Mansion fire, which remained unknown until his journal's discovery 14 years later. He was buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago, where his gravestone identifies him by his assumed name Isaiah Freeman, with dates 1825-1909. His widow Sarah lived until 1919, and their 4 children produced 11 grandchildren who scattered across Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan during the Great Migration. Descendants of Isaiah Freeman number approximately 200 people as of 2020, most of them unaware of their ancestors' role in one of the most dramatic acts of resistance during the slavery era. The 34 enslaved people who survived the Thornhill Mansion fire were sold at a state auction in Clark County, Alabama on February 14, 1860, for prices ranging from $400 for elderly workers to $1,400 for young adults. Records indicate they were purchased by 12 different buyers from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. 3 of the survivors, names unknown, escaped to Union lines during the Civil War and obtained freedom under the Emancipation Proclamation. The fate of the remaining 31 survivors is unknown, lost in the incomplete records of slavery's final years. The slave quarters where Isaiah had lived for 11 years burned in 1863, and no physical trace of them remains at the plantation site. Robert Hayes, the overseer who led the search for Isaiah, died in Clark County in 1887 at age 66. He worked as overseer on 2 other plantations after the Thornhill estate closed, then operated a small farm after the Civil War ended slavery and eliminated the need for overseers. His obituary mentioned his role in investigating the Thornhill fire, but described Isaiah's escape as a mystery that was never solved. Unaware that Isaiah had lived for another 22 years after Hayes's death and had left a detailed record of exactly how the mystery had unfolded. Charles Brennan, the Boston merchant who provided Isaiah with transport on his yacht and who deliberately misdirected Sullivan's search party, continued his cotton trading business until 1876, when he retired at age 68. He never publicly discussed his role in Isaiah's escape, but private letters discovered in his papers in 1934 revealed that he had assisted at least 7 other fugitive slaves during his trading trips to the South between 1852 and 1861. Brennan died in Boston in 1882, and his yacht was donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, where it is preserved as an example of pre-Civil War commercial river vessels. The rendered animal fat technique that Isaiah used as an accelerant was independently rediscovered by arson investigators in the 1920s during studies of industrial fires in meatpacking plants. The investigators documented that fat-based fires burn hotter and spread faster than wood fires alone. And they developed the same distributed ignition patterns that Isaiah had used to ensure total destruction of the Thornhill mansion. The investigators had no knowledge of Isaiah's 1859 fire when they documented these findings, meaning they independently verified the effectiveness of his method 60 years after he had pioneered it. Isaiah Webb Freeman burned down a mansion worth $18,000 using kitchen grease and cotton scraps. He killed 7 people who had destroyed his family. He escaped through 600 miles of hostile territory. He fought in the Civil War. He lived 50 years as a free man in Chicago. He died at age 84, surrounded by family. The system that enslaved him collapsed 4 years after he lit the fuse in Thornhill's basement. His journal documenting everything was found 14 years after his death and confirmed every detail. The plantation site where he was enslaved is now a cornfield with a historical marker describing what he did there on November 8, 1859.